So we all know about the Atari 50 collection that came out a little over a year ago, but what about this one? This game, called Atari Flashback Classics, came out 3 years prior and even has more games. Could this be the better solution over Atari 50? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Pojer coming at you with another video. Alright, so if you're a regular watcher of my videos and you're not subscribed, definitely hit that button right down there. It only takes a second, but it helps out the community a lot. And you'll be notified when I make a new video. And if you're interested, we do have a Discord server. Just go to discord.pojer.net. I'll also put a link right in the description. Alright, let's talk about Atari Flashback Classics. Atari 50 is a collection of old Atari games that was released on modern consoles. The game list is where the collection really shines because they included titles from more obscure consoles that we don't commonly see, like the 5200, 7800, and Jaguar. Most Atari collections only feature 2600 or arcade titles. They got the selection of games 95%, with a majority of the games being on here that I expected. There's only a few missing. The emulation is perfect, the games control really well with the Pro Controller, and you can customize how you want your games to look. They didn't just include old games, but they also added some reimagined games like Sword Quest Airworld. They even added a timeline mode where you can read the entire history of Atari with pictures and videos that you can see. It's clear that Digital Eclipse put a lot of care into this game. It's not just a collection, but it's a full experience. But there might be some confusion because this is not the first Atari collection on modern consoles. On the PS4 and Xbox One, there were 3 Atari collections called Atari Flashback Classics, each of which had 50 games. So why 3 collections? Why couldn't they consolidate these? Thankfully, the Switch version actually does that. So now we have a massive collection with 150 games on it, even more than Atari 50. Speaking of games, here's the included 2600 titles. For the first time, I believe that I can say that every title is on here that I expected. I can't think of a single one that they missed, outside of licensed titles that are obviously never going to be on collections like these. Here's the 5200 games. As expected, it's a much smaller list. The 5200 did not have a huge library of games, and the ones they did have were mainly licensed ones like Pac-Man. It's cool that they even included 5200 games because that's not a console that would normally be on collections like these. Here's the 7800 games. Yeah, they didn't put any on here. That actually surprises me considering that they included 5200 games. Why one but not the other? And finally, here's the arcade titles. This is a very strong list with even some unreleased games like Maze Invaders being on here. There's a few missing games like Breakout, but this is still a very good collection of games. Overall, while it's unfortunate that there's no 7800 titles, I really can't complain about 150 games. Again, Atari 50 only has 115 games, but it does support more consoles. The company AtGames was actually behind this collection, who also made the Atari Flashback plug-and-play units. AtGames has had a very questionable history. Their earlier consoles were very low quality, and later on they would deceptively put NES games on their Namco collection when the box showed the arcade versions. To be fair though, they have mainly cleaned up their act, and I heard that their new products like the AtGames Legends arcade cabinet are actually pretty good. I am a little nervous about this collection being made by AtGames, but before we judge, let's try it out. The menu is very simplistic. The game is in grid form, which makes it a bit easier to spot the game you're looking for. You also get a visual of the front of the label of the cartridges. I actually like this. Atari 50 gave you a nice visual, but sometimes it was hard to find the game you wanted because it's a horizontal list. Speaking of Atari 50, in that game you could sort by release date, by console, and by alphabet, but here it's just one big list. The arcade titles are separated, but the 2600 and 5200 games are jumbled in the same list. Despite it maybe not looking as pretty though, I actually like this menu better. You have basic customization settings. You can add or remove bezels for arcade games, change the scan lines, and modify the volume. However, the 2600 games don't have bezels at all, which is a minor setback. When you boot a game, you get a mock-up 2600 at the bottom where you can modify the game settings, just like you could on original hardware. At the top, you're told what each game variation does, which is extremely helpful. However, you can't see a full list of them on the screen like you could in Atari 50 unless you look at the instruction manual, I guess. I actually prefer the way Atari 50 did it, and it's unfortunate that now it's like this in Flashback Classics. The 5200 games have a completely different interface. Here, there's a menu on the left side. It almost looks like a completely different person made this emulator. Overall, as far as settings go, Atari 50 definitely wins, but this game does give you enough. The emulation of the games feels close to perfect. I didn't notice any sound or graphical issues with any of them. The games that use analog controls feel great with a Pro Controller. The game Sentinel originally used the Atari light gun, but on here you have a cursor that you control instead. I think that's the best solution AtGames could have come up with. Some Atari 5200 games had to be adjusted heavily. For example, the game Miniature Golf actually requires you to use the left menu bar. In order to hit the ball at a certain force, you must select from the options. This is very clunky and I don't like it, but there's not much they could have done. The original game used the number pads on a 5200 controller, which is too many buttons for a Switch controller. This was most likely the best way they could have handled this outside of not including the game at all, which maybe they should have done that. Overall, the emulation is near perfect and they did the best they could with the controls. Now, let's take a look at a few games individually. Here's Major Havoc. It's a vector game that's divided into two parts. In the first part, it's a shooter where you're trying to destroy the enemies that are trying to protect the reactor ship. Once you get rid of them, you can land on it and it becomes a platformer. Here, you must destroy the reactor and then exit the ship as soon as possible. The controls during the platformer part are definitely hard to get used to. Your jump is very slow, and when you hit the ceiling, you fall straight down. Your character is also very slippery. To be fair, Atari might have done this on purpose since this is space. Unfortunately, this game never received a console release. I can see why. It would have been hard to port a game like this considering the 3D graphics during the shooting part and the large scrolling levels during the platformer part. It probably would have needed to be modified heavily. Here's Warlords. It's essentially a 4-player game of Breakout. You control one corner and you must keep the fireballs from reaching your center. If it does, you're out of the game. You're able to hold on to the fireball and fire them off at a faster speed in order to throw off your opponents. The Atari 2600 version is on here too, and while the graphics are more bare bones, they kept the core gameplay the same. These are both fantastic titles. I'm glad that they were included on here. Now for Superbug. You play as a Volkswagen Beetle and you must drive around the track and follow the arrows until you run out of gas. Perhaps they should have called this Beetle Adventure Racing. The controls are a bit difficult to get used to. Each of the 4 buttons on the Switch Pro controller represent a gear, and it's easy to switch to the wrong gear by mistake. There's not much to this game, but for 1977 standards, this is really cool. Shockingly, some of Mattel's games made it on here. In Frogs and Flies, you must collect as many flies as possible by jumping from one lily pad to another. Star Strike, which was originally an Intellivision game, is an ambitious 3D-like shooter where you must protect Earth from being destroyed. Space Attack, which is a port of Space Battle on the Intellivision, is a shooting game where you must keep the enemies from reaching the center by approaching them for battle. In Dark Cavern, which is Night Stalker on the Intellivision, you play as a man who is trapped in a maze and you must shoot the enemies around you. I didn't expect Mattel's Atari 2600 ports to show up on here, but this is one selling point over Atari 50 if you really like these games. Now for Yar's Return. This is a ROM hack of Yar's Revenge that came from Atari Flashback 2. Here, you must shoot down the red barriers so you're able to access the main enemy in the center. Then, you can aim your cannon inside and destroy them. The original game scrolled up and down, so it was much harder to aim the cannon, but here, the screen doesn't move at all, so it's very easy to hit your target. I never found this game as enjoyable as the original, and I don't care that it's on here. This collection would also get other ROM hacks from Flashback 2 as well, like Return to Haunted House and Adventure 2. Overall, in terms of game selection, Flashback Classics definitely beat Atari 50, no doubt about that. But it's worth considering that there's not as many consoles represented on here as Atari 50. There's no 7800, Lynx, or Jaguar games. Now let's talk about the bonus content. In Atari 50, we got brand new reimagined games. These were all newer versions of their original counterparts, like Breakout for example. Sword Quest Air World was another cool game that they added. They didn't just include retro games, but Digital Eclipse created some brand new ones too. With Flashback Classics, however, you get absolutely nothing additional besides the 150 games. For some, this might be perfectly fine. Most people who are buying these collections aren't doing it for the new content, they're doing it to play retro games. However, it's worth talking about because if you're looking for bonus content, you're not going to find that here. There's one last thing I wanted to mention. In December, Atari added 12 new games on Atari 50 for free, bringing the list of games up to 115. The fact that they did this completely for free is very generous, and it proves that Atari is accommodating the fans. I mention this for a few reasons. Atari might add more games in the future, and you may feel better about having a collection that continuously keeps getting updated. AtGames is most likely not going to update Flashback Classics, not that it needs it. This is a what-if scenario. For all we know, Atari may never update Atari 50 ever again, but it's worth considering. So which collection do I recommend? Atari Flashback Classics has a lot going for it. This is a more basic collection with everything you need and nothing more. I like the game list menu way better, and there's a lot more included games on this. However, there's no bonus content, there's no games for more obscure consoles, and there's some customizing you can't do. Atari 50 has way better presentation. You can tell they put a lot of care into this. The collection still does have a lot of games, including ones from more obscure consoles, and there's even a lot of bonus content, but there's still not as many games. So if you're just looking for the most amount of games or don't care about bonus content, you're going to want Flashback Classics. But if you want 7800 Jaguar or Lynx games and like having bonus content, Atari 50 is the way to go. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.